All right, Panthers. So today we're going to talk about one of the most monumental, one of the most memorable, one of the biggest events from the 20th century. Today we're going to talk about Reagan's second term, which was not necessarily the big event, but the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. This was a huge event. It was an event that nobody really saw coming. It was an event that just happened so fast, so fast. The end of the Cold War happened. So let's get into it. The fall and the triumph. Okay, so Ronald Reagan has been elected to a second term. Overwhelmingly, Reagan is elected to a second term. Reagan wins every single state except for Minnesota. That was the only state he didn't win in 1984. So Reagan is a tremendously popular president. And then, shortly after his second term begins, the rumors of a scandal begin to come out. The Iran Contra scandal. This is a this is on the same level almost as Watergate. This almost cost Reagan his second term in office. Now, you got to stick with me because this is going to get really sticky. This is going to get really confusing. And if you don't pay attention, it's going to be as clear as mud. So, a couple of components that we've got to introduce before we can get into the scandal. First off is Iran. Iran was a very close ally, probably our closest friend in the Middle East, closest Arab friend for sure in the Middle East, from the 1950s through the 1970s. The United States supported a very repressive regime there that brutalized their citizens and took away a lot of their rights and violated a lot of their human rights. But we kind of looked the other way. The United States did, and we really didn't interfere with the human rights violations that were taking place in Iran because the government in Iran from the 1950s through the 70s were very anti communist. So as long as they were there, communism wasn't going to go to Iran. So we really didn't care what they did as long as they weren't communist. Well, in 1978, there is a revolution that takes place in Iran, the Islamic Revolution. And an Islamic, very harsh, very conservative Islamic government takes over in Iran. And as a result, several things happen, but as a result of this revolution and the Iranian people's frustration with the United States over their support of this very harsh regime in Iran before the Islamic Revolution, a group of college students invaded the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took the American hostages hostage and kept 52 Americans hostage in Iran for 444 days. And the United States seemingly was powerless. And if you remember back when we were talking about Jimmy Carter, this ultimately cost Carter his presidency because Carter just seemed inept in his ability to get the hostages out. And the hostages are only released, literally released, 5 minutes after Reagan takes the oath of office as president of the United States. So there's that component. There's Iran. After the Iranian hostage crisis, we don't like Iran. Then there's another problem that begins to take place in the early 80s, about midway through Reagan's first term, 82, 83, 84. Americans begin to get taken hostage in a small country in the Middle East, Beirut. And these Americans are being taken hostage because they're Americans, and there's a lot of anti-American feelings and hatred in the Middle East at this time. And so Americans, just regular, everyday American citizens, are being taken hostage in Beirut. And we are desperately trying to figure out, one, who took the hostages, and two, where the hostages are at. And we can't seem to find them. And every so often, a new hostage is taking place, is being taken in Beirut. And so the Reagan administration is worried that since these Americans are being taken hostage in Beirut, it may hurt him in the 1984 elections. So that's that. So we have Iran, we hate Iran, and then we have these American hostages being taken in Beirut. Add into this the Iran-Iraq war. It's a border dispute. Iran and Iraq are right next door to each other, and Iraq attacks Iran over this border. And because we don't like Iran, we begin giving a lot of weapons to the Iranians, or excuse me, to the Iraqis. And as a result of money and weapons from the United States, Iraq just brutalizes Iran. I mean, Iran really gets it handed to them in this war. And war is not going well for Iran. So those are the three different things that we have going on here, right? We have the Iranians we don't like. We have these American hostages being taken in Beirut that the Reagan administration is worried may hurt him in his reelection in 1984. And then we have this war between Iran and Iraq in which the United States, because they're fighting Iran, the United States supports Iraq, and Iraq definitely has the upper hand in this war. So three very different things are going to come into this. One more thing we're going to add in. These people known as the Contras, and it's happening in Nicaragua. So in Nicaragua, there is a communist revolution taking place. And the United States definitely doesn't want communism to come to Nicaragua, right? The Truman Doctrine, we got to contain the spread of communism. This also seems to go against the Monroe Doctrine, where there's not going to be any foreign influence in the Western Hemisphere. And if the communists take over in Nicaragua, then there's a fear that the domino theory will take place and it'll go to Honduras and on and on and on and on. And pretty soon Mexico is communist and we're fighting a communist across a river. So we're very worried about this revolution taking place, this communist revolution taking place in Nicaragua. And the people who are fighting against the communists are known as the Contras, right? That's just the name of their army. They're kind of a guerrilla force. They're not an actual trained army. So they're called the Contras. Well, Ronald Reagan heats up the Cold War. Ronald Reagan calls the Soviet Union and communism, the focus of evil in the world and things like that. And Ronald Reagan is not really interested in containing communism. The Reagan Doctrine is about getting rid of communism, not containing it, which was the Truman Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine is let's get rid of it. And it seems to go against the Reagan Doctrine if we allow Nicaragua to become communist. So Reagan definitely wants to support the Contras to keep the communists out of Nicaragua. However, the Contras are not much better than the communists. The Contras are responsible for a lot of human rights violations and atrocities that take place in Nicaragua. Lots of people are killed by the Contras. So the Contras, although they're not communist, really are not much better morally than the communists are. So the United States stops supporting the Contras because of these atrocities that they were committing in Nicaragua. We stopped sending them weapons and we stopped sending them money, which means the communists in Nicaragua, who are being supported by the Soviet Union, begin to win this revolution in Nicaragua because the United States is no longer supporting the Contras, but the Soviet Union is supporting the communists in Nicaragua. Things begin to turn against the communists in favor of Nicaragua, which would not be good for Reagan again going into the 1984 election. Whew. I know, lots of stuff here, right? The Iranians, we hate them. The Iranian hostage crisis. the American hostages being taken in Beirut, which the Reagan administration is worried may hurt them in 1984. This Iran-Iraq war, which the United States supports Iraq in because they're not Iranians, and the Iraqis are winning because they're getting all these weapons and money from the United States. And then this revolution taking place in Central America, in Nicaragua. The United States was supporting the Contras because they weren't communist. And then the Contras are not much better than the communists that they're fighting. So we stopped funding the Contras, which Reagan is worried may hurt his reelection chances in 1984 because he's all about getting rid of communism. Okay, so there's all these things happening. How do these things all relate? Oh, I'm glad you asked. Here we go. Here's what happened. Just before the election in 1984, Iran contacts the United States. And they tell the United States government, they tell the Reagan administration, we know who took these hostages in Beirut. We know who they are. We know where your hostages are at. And we can get your hostages freed. We can negotiate on your behalf to free these hostages. The United States goes, well, that's kind of interesting that Iran is doing this. Why do you want this? And Iran said, well, we need weapons. We need weapons to fight the Iraqis. What if we bought weapons from you to fight the Iraqis? We would then negotiate with the hostage takers in Beirut and free the American hostages just before the 1984 election. Okay, so the United States does do this. The Reagan administration gives the green light. We sell weapons to Iran, so now we're selling weapons to both Iran and Iraq, so they're shooting each other with our weapons. All of a sudden, in 1984, these American hostages in Beirut begin to get released, which you can see in the picture there. That's one of the hostages coming home. All of these American hostages all of a sudden are being released. That's a big thumbs up for Reagan. But a big problem now. We've sold these weapons to Iran, but we never asked Congress, right? Congress has to say yes or no to arms sale. These weapons that are being sold to Iran are being sold without the knowledge or the approval of Congress. Oof, that's not good. On top of that, we all of a sudden have all of this money coming in seemingly from nowhere. We've got to account for this money because somebody in Congress is going to go, I wonder where this new money came from. So the Reagan administration takes this money and immediately sends it to the Contras in Nicaragua to help the Contras fight this war against the communists. Oh boy. So, in a nutshell, the Reagan administration sells weapons without congressional approval to the Iranians to fight the Iraqis, who were also supplying with weapons. The Iranians negotiate for the release of American hostages just before the 1984 election. These hostages are released. And then the United States, to make sure that the administration, just to make sure that this money doesn't appear anywhere in government records, the money from the sales of these weapons to Iran is immediately sent to the Contras to help in their fight against the communists in Nicaragua. Oh, boy. Well, shortly after Reagan's second term begins, this story comes out. Oh boy. Reagan claims that he didn't have any knowledge of any of this happening. Reagan said he didn't know this was happening. This was happening without his knowledge or his approval. Reagan says, I definitely would never approve that. And everything that we've found since then seems to indicate that maybe, quite possibly, Reagan didn't know. There's no smoking gun, so to speak. linking the scandal directly to Reagan, unlike Watergate, where there definitely was evidence linking Nixon directly into the Watergate break in and then cover up. There's nothing that's ever come out that says, yes, Reagan knew about this. Reagan's presidential style was very hands off. Reagan really didn't get into the nuts and bolts and the nitty gritty of his administration. Reagan kind of set the agenda and then assumed those who worked in his administration would do it, and he really didn't have a lot of follow up or oversight over what they did. So it's entirely possible these people, the people who were involved in this, did not ever tell Reagan what was happening, and Reagan may not have ever known. But it definitely was not a good look that the United States was now working with our mortal enemy, the Iranians, for political gain, all behind Congress's back. And Reagan's immense popularity does take a hit, although it's momentary. Reagan does eventually regain back his popularity and leaves the presidency as one of the most popular presidents in American history, and is still regarded today as one of the most popular presidents in American history. A national security advisor in the Reagan administration, a guy by the name of Oliver North, who is a colonel in the United States Marine, testifies that it was his idea, and he's the one who orchestrated this, and he takes the fall for it. He maintains Reagan never had any knowledge, that they worked to keep Reagan from knowing anything about any of this. And Oliver North eventually goes to prison over it. But this was a huge scandal, and it's very confusing. It's very convoluted. There's all these little twists and turns in it, but it almost cost Reagan his presidency. There was serious talk that Reagan was on his way out before his second term really got going. If they could have linked this directly to Reagan, that Reagan knew this was something that was happening, it definitely would have cost Reagan his presidency. So that's a huge scandal, almost cost Reagan his presidency. However, something else is about to happen in the middle of Reagan's second term that is going to save his popularity and make him immensely popular. Some of it is because of policies that he had, but some of what is about to happen was completely out of his control and just sheer luck. A new leader comes to power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev is a lifelong dedicated member of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, rising through the ranks of the party till eventually he becomes the leader of the Soviet Union, the Soviet premier. Mikhail Gorbachev recognizes there are some inherent problems, some real underlying problems in the Soviet Union when he comes to power. One of the problems is that the Soviet Union simply doesn't have the money to do everything that they wanted to do. The communist economic system in which the government controls production of everything and controls the manufacturing of everything and controls the economy, where it's a state-based economy, really limits the ability for the economy to grow. Reagan, who, when he becomes president, declares the Soviet Union the evil empire, and the communism and the Soviet Union is the focus of evil around the world. And Reagan, remember the Reagan doctrine, we're going to get rid of communism. Reagan begins to massively increase the defense spending, massively begins to increase defense spending, and does this rapid arms buildup, knowing the Soviet Union will try to follow suit. The Soviet Union definitely does. As the United States increases its military spending, the Soviet Union increases its military spending. As the United States begins to build up its arms, the Soviet Union begins to build up its arms. It's in this race to keep up with the United States. What was happening is that in the Soviet Union, because it's a state-controlled economy, the Soviet Union just didn't, their economy didn't have the ability to grow to do all of these things. So, as the Soviet Union is building up its military, that means that less money is going to other things in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet economy is extraordinarily weak at this point because they're not able to produce enough consumer goods, things that just regular Soviet citizens need. And Mikhail Gorbachev recognizes this problem. The United States, because the government doesn't control the economy, that there's, we don't control manufacturing, we don't control how much is going to be made, and things like that's all private industry. The United States can grow its economy very quickly, and the United States government really only has to worry about defense spending. This, in reality, Soviet Union didn't have that, and Mikhail Gorbachev realizes that and realizes Soviet Union is in real economic trouble trying to keep up with the United States. Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan become very, very, very good friends. They really hit it off. They're personally, they become very, 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 very close friends, very good, tight friends. Politically, they become, they're not friends politically, but they definitely are able to work together. And tensions between the United States and Soviet Union begin to thaw once Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader. And Mikhail Gorbachev begins to do things to reform the Soviet society. One of the first things he does is he institutes a policy called Glasnost. 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 And it takes away a lot of the censorship that the Soviet Union had over society, over content. No longer was the Soviet Union government going to control everything that you see, everything that you hear, everything that you read, everything that you know. Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev begins to lift a lot of those restrictions under Glasnost, and it begins to allow for dissenting voices. It begins to allow for more free speech. This is an attempt to, one, reform the Soviet society, and two, take a lot off the plate of the Soviet government, who use a lot of resources trying to censor what you see, what you hear, what you read. Next thing that he does is he brings in what's known as perestroika. And you see the word there. Perestroika is where the Soviet Union begins to bring in elements of capitalism, elements of the free market, so that the Soviet Union is no longer completely controlling everything that's happening in the economy. Because again, Soviet Union couldn't do this effectively, keeping this military race with the United States while also maintaining a civilian economy. So this begins to allow for more free enterprise, more ownership of property, more decisions about what to make, when to make, how to make. So these are two big shifts that begin to take place in the Soviet Union: perestroika and glasnost. The Soviet Union seems to be leaving a lot of its very authoritarian dictatorial powers. At the same time, Gorbachev and Reagan, who become very, very good, close personal friends, also begin to work to begin to thaw this Cold War. That leads to some monumental changes. All right, so we get to 1988. We're going to have a new election. George Bush, who's Reagan's vice president, runs for president. George Bush says, if you like Reagan, and Americans definitely loved Reagan. Reagan was an immensely popular president, despite the Iran-Contra scandal. George Bush says, if you like Reagan, you're going to love me. I'm just more of the same. The Democrats nominate the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. And Michael Dukakis runs what is universally acknowledged as one of the single worst political campaigns in the history of American politics. Unbelievably bad. Michael Dukakis is frequently criticized, was frequently criticized for not being tough enough and not being pro-military enough. So to prove how tough he is and how pro-military he was, Michael Dukakis decided it would be a really good idea to go out to a army base and ride around in a tank, dress up in a tank helmet and ride around in a tank and show just how pro-military and how tough he was. Well, you see what he looked like. He looked like a dork. And Michael Dukakis runs this in a political campaign ad showing I'm pro-military and I'm a tough guy and I love our soldiers. And he looks so ridiculous in it that the Bush campaign took those exact same film clips and those exact same pictures and said, look at this guy. Is this the guy you want to be president? Woof. And then there was the infamous Willie Horton case. Michael Dukakis, as governor of Massachusetts, instituted a policy for prisoners who were in jail, a furlough program where prisoners who were on good behavior, who were pretty good people, they could be furloughed for the weekend, meaning they could leave jail and go home. And then they had to come back on Monday. So this was for good prisoners who were not violent, who were not bad. They were just there, for shoplifting or whatever. Well, this guy, Willie Horton, gets released. Willie Horton is in prison for murder and rape. And somehow Willie Horton qualified for the furlough program. And Willie Horton went out on the weekend, and Willie Horton didn't come back on Monday. And before they found Willie Horton, he had killed and murdered and raped. Killed and murder, I guess are the same thing. Raped and murdered some people. Oh boy. Well, that doesn't play well. And race gets thrown in, and it becomes a very racially charged moment in the campaign. And Michael Dukakis never recovers. George Bush wins overwhelmingly. Oh boy. Right as George Bush takes office, some crazy things begin to happen in Europe with communism. You can see there's the Iron Curtain. This is a division between democracy and freedom and the communist world. All of this is communist. Well, some things begin to happen in the Eastern Europe because of the reforms and because of the economic problems that the Soviet Union is having. They are no longer able to maintain control of or the troop presence that they once had on the Iron Curtain, on the front here, this division. And there was literally a wall between Hungary and Austria. Literally a wall, a fence that had been put up between Hungary, which was communist, and Austria, which was not. Well, because the Soviet Union is no longer able to fund and maintain these things, some of that fence falls down. And the Soviet Union never does anything to repair it or fix it. As word begins to spread throughout Eastern Europe, people who are living in Eastern Europe and who are not happy about living in communism say, I'm going to go on vacation to, I don't know, Hungary. And then they're in Austria and I'm free. And all of a sudden there's all these people pouring from Eastern Germany down into Hungary, going into Austria, and then going into West Germany and being reunited with friends and family they haven't seen for 30 years. Oh boy. This becomes like a hole in the dam. Once you get a hole in the dam and water begins to come out, more and more and more, and the hole gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the dam begins to become very weak. That's what's happening here. Brings us to November of 1989. Oh boy. Protesters begin to show up daily at the Berlin Wall, the symbol of communism, the symbol of the Cold War. Literally a concrete wall surrounding West Berlin, cutting West Berlin off from East Berlin and East Germany. This has become the symbol of the Cold War, and protesters begin to show up daily at the Berlin Wall, demanding that the wall come down. Reagan, in 1987, just before the end of his presidency, Reagan famously goes to the Berlin Wall and calls out Mikhail Gorbachev and said, if you truly believe in all the things that you say you believe, and you truly believe in all of these reforms that you're instituting, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Famous speech, very famous speech. So protesters are now beginning to show up at the wall daily, demanding that the wall come down. And the world waits for the Soviet Union, who really controls East Germany. East Germany was the crown jewel communist country in Europe at this time, right? It was the dominant communist government in Eastern Europe. The world starts waiting for the Soviet Union to tell the East German soldiers, you've got to end this. And they don't. The East German soldiers never open fire, which is what they would have done in the past. The East German soldiers never crush the protests, which they would have done in the past. The Soviet Union doesn't do anything to stop these protests. And the protests continue to build and build and build and build until suddenly, November 9th, a section of the Berlin Wall comes down. And there's no reaction from the Soviet Union or East Germany. No reaction. Well, this sets off a frenzy of people on both sides of the wall who now begin to attack the wall with sledgehammers and picks and shovels and anything they could find to begin to bring this wall down. And the Soviet Union and the East German government let it happen. In many cases, East German soldiers begin to participate in bringing down the wall. And now the wall is done. It's over. There's no repercussions. There's no one being killed. In the past, when people tried to climb over the wall from East Germany into West Germany, the East Germans would shoot and kill them and stop that from happening. That was no longer the truth. And East German soldiers themselves were crossing the wall and helping bring down the wall. This was a huge moment in the world. This was a huge moment in 20th century history. I remember watching it on TV. I was in college watching it happen on TV, and I was astounded at what I was watching. It was so big, in fact, David Hasselhoff. Yes, that David Hasselhoff, for whatever reason, shows up. For whatever reason, he was a huge rock star in Germany. I don't know why. He was a rock star. He's an actor in the United States. In Germany, he was a rock star. You figure that out. For whatever reason, out of nowhere, and I mean nowhere, David Hasselhoff shows up at the Berlin Wall in a black leather jacket with lights flashing all over it, singing a song about freedom. What? I know. Go check it out. It's on YouTube. Check it out. It is insane. Well, this leads to a flood, a flurry of East German governments overthrowing communism. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. I mean, just the list goes on and on and on and on of all these all these Eastern European countries that were under a communist regime who were being controlled by the Soviet Union, one by one, after Germany. All of these countries begin to overthrow and get rid of their communist governments until eventually it's just the Soviet Union left as the communist country in Europe, and that's about to change. Hardline communists who are very worried about what's happening in Eastern Europe and who's very worried about the state of communism and who are very angry with Mikhail Gorbachev because of his reforms, all of a sudden stormed the Kremlin, which is where the seat of the Russian government. They stormed the Kremlin and they kidnapped Mikhail Gorbachev and his family in an attempt to show the old Soviet Union, the old communists are still in power. Don't mess with us, right? We can make bad things happen. And they storm they stormed the Kremlin and they kidnapped Mikhail Gorbachev and his family. And then these hardline communists go on TV and say, we're in charge. We took Gorbachev. You're going to pay attention to us. And all of these silly reforms that he brought in are over. Don't try anything crazy, Russian people. Well, the Russian people did do crazy things. Instead of cowering in fear and worried like they would have been under Stalin or Khrushchev or somebody like that, the Russian people went to the Kremlin and protested, massive protests against what the hardline communists had done. And the hardline communists realize they've lost. They no longer have control of the country. And so after a week, they release Gorbachev. One of the first things Gorbachev does is he goes to the Duma, which is like the Russian Congress. He orders the Communist Party outlawed. And then all of these little tiny countries that Russia had taken over in the 1920s, 1930s, all of these little tiny countries that Russia had taken over, expanding the scope of communism and creating the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is just Russia with a bunch of little countries all together. All of these little countries that made up the Soviet Union begin to leave. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Moldavia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. All of these little tiny countries were all taken over by Russia in the 1920s and 30s and absorbed to create the Soviet Union. Well, now all of these countries, after it becoming very obvious that the communists are no longer really the power in the Soviet Union anymore, all of these little countries who were forced to stay by the Soviet army, by the communists, vote to leave and become independent countries, leaving only Russia. And communism collapsed in Russia. And the war is over. And the United States wins. After a 40-plus year war between the United States and the Soviet Union, it ends in dramatic fashion. And the United States stands alone. Now, there were people I remember at the time who said, well, this is the end of history. No more, because history is all about conflict, and this was the last big conflict. The United States has won. There are no more big threats out there. Democracy and freedom and the United States have won. And then comes terrorism, and history continues on. All right, that's the notes for today. Take care, and we'll see you guys later.